السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على ختم الأنبياء وإمام الأصفياء وقدوة الأتقياء سيدنا ونبينا محمد خاتم الأنبياء وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. الحمد لله. As we continue to look at the opening of our Dars Kanz al-Daqa'iq, in which we're looking at one of the most important of the mutun, of the primers of the Hanafi school, we are going to be looking just a little bit at Imam al-Nasafi himself, the author of this text. Secondly, we're going to be looking at Kanz al-Daqa'iq itself as a text and its importance and some of the commentaries that are written upon it. And then we're going to take, in the third part, the opening of the text. And it's important to give the beginning its due, because it's from husnul ibtida, from having a good beginning, right? Having a good beginning. We could say a lot about Imam al-Nasafi, the author of Kanz al-Daqa'iq, but we won't, right? Because that would take us far from our core purpose, but there are some details that are important to know. Now, firstly, it is very important to be clear that there are many Nasafis in the Hanafi school. Right? There are many Nasafis in the Hanafi school. So when we say Imam al-Nasafi, when the ulama say Imam al-Nasafi, this is a referential, right? And it depends on context which Nasafi you mean. So there's a famous work, and sometimes the ulama rely on shorthand amongst each other. So there is a famous Sharh al-Aqaid al-Nasafiyya. It's by a particular Nasafi. They'll say Tilbatu Talaba of al-Nasafi. That's by a particular Nasafi. So there are a great many central Nasafis, and it's something that may come up, and we'll look at it. But the Nasafi that we're talking about, Imam Abul Barakat, Hafiz al-Din al-Nasafi, his name is, and he's famous as Imam Hafiz al-Din al-Nasafi, or Abul Barakat Hafiz al-Din al-Nasafi. His full name is Abdullah ibn Ahmad ibn Mahmud. Abdullah ibn Ahmad ibn Mahmud Abul Barakat Hafiz al-Din al-Nasafi. And we'll see some of the titles given to him in the opening of the book, right? He is one of the most significant of the late scholars of the Hanafi madhab, right? His name, al-Nasafi, goes back to a town called Nasaf, right? Nasaf. And it's from the lands of what's called a Sughd with respect to Islamic scholarship, the far eastern lands of Islamic scholarship. Bilad ma wara al-Nahar, the lands beyond the Oxus River, right? And it was between Jayhun and the great city of Samarkand, right? So it's between Samarkand and Bukhara, basically, right? These two great cities. the Hanafis, interestingly, did not pay a lot of attention to a lot of biographical background about their Imams. So much so that we have great authors in the madhab, we know relatively little about their biographical details. So we don't know explicitly where he was born, right? And likewise, his date of birth is also unknown broadly, right? Some estimated it just by his, by the sense of age that they had, and given that of his main teachers was Shamsul A'imma al-Kardari, Shamsul A'imma Muhammad ibn Abd al-Sattar al-Kardari, who died 642. So to have studied with him, right, they estimate that he would have been born around the year 620 or thereabouts after the Hijrah. And there's also difference, interestingly, about when he died. So Imam al-Laknawi argues that he died in the year 710, Imam Abd al-Hayy al-Laknawi, whereas Mullah Ali al-Qari argued that he died in the year 701, right? Right? The seven, so it's somewhere between that, right? And you can see and he died in the town of Idaj. That's of secondary importance. Right? So the main numbers are either 701 or 710, and some say between 701 and 710. Okay. Imam al-Nasafi, and part of the reason is these lands were, a lot happened historically, at that time and after, cutting off those lands from the rest of the Muslim, of Islamic scholarship to some extent, right? And as a result, we don't have a lot of biographical details, especially about the Bilad Mawara al-Nahar as a result, right? And of his most important teachers, if you say who is the most important teachers of Imam al-Nasafi, there are three, right? There are three, right? The first is Shamsul A'imma Muhammad ibn Abd al-Sattar al-Kardari, that we mentioned before, who died 642 after the Hijrah. He's probably of the senior most of his teachers, right? That's number one, right? Shamsul A'imma Muhammad ibn Abd al-Sattar al-Kardari, who died 642. Second, Humayduddin al-Darir, also known as al-Ramishi. Humayduddin al-Darir al-Ramishi, who died in the year 666 after the Hijrah. And they're evidently very close. Imam al-Nasafi is the one who prayed his Salat al-Janazah. So from that they estimate that he must have been, at least past 40 at the time. And he's the one who placed him in the grave, right? And he was a very distinguished, both of these are great scholars in the Hanafi madhab. Shams al-A'imma al-Kardari and Humayduddin al-Darir al-Ramishi. who died 666. The third is Khwahirzada. Khwahirzada, right? Badruddin Khwahirzada, who was the maternal nephew of Shams al-Aimma al-Kardari. So it's Badruddin Khwahirzada al-Kardari, famous as Khwahirzada, who died in the year 651. Right? After the Hijrah. So these are his three main teachers. Right? These are his three main teachers. Shams al-Aimma al-Kardari, Humayduddin al-Darir al-Ramishi, and Khwahirzada. And basically there are two people between Imam al-Nasafi and the author of the Hidayah, Imam al-Marghinani. Right? Right? And he had many significant students as well. We don't need to go into all those things. You can find listing of them. But his influence is evident that a whole number of his students wrote significant works in the Hanafi school. Amongst them, As-Sighnaqi, right, who died similar year as Imam al-Nasafi, 711 or thereabouts, who wrote the largest commentary written on the Hidayah. Yeah, it was called Al-Nihaya. And also Ibn al-Sa'ati, who wrote a very important work, Majma' al-Bahrain and its commentaries, and many important works, Ibn al-Sa'ati, right? And a bunch of others. But these two scholars, As-Sighnaqi and Ibn al-Sa'ati, who also died before al-Nasafi, who died 694. And that's why you can't just assume that someone who dies before someone must have come after him. No. Like the two most significant students of Imam al-Nasafi, As-Sighnaqi, who wrote the largest commentary on the Hidayah, died either the same year or a year after al-Nasafi, but was actually a student of his. And also wrote some important works in Usul al-Fiqh. And Ibn al-Sa'ati, who was deeply influential both in fiqh and Usul al-Fiqh, who wrote Majma' al-Bahrain in fiqh and al-Badi' in Usul al-Fiqh, who died 694. But he died aged only 43. He was born 651, Ibn al-Sa'ati. And there's a whole story behind him. We'll leave that. Separately, right? And most of the teachers of Imam al-Nasafi are considered from the Bukharan scholars, right? Are of the Bukharan scholars, right? And there would be different priority, the fatwa would vary slightly between the ulama of Iraq and Wara al-Nahar, and even between Bukhara and Samarkand, there were some slight differences present, but that's beyond our scope right now. Right? And we'll look next at some of Imam Nasafi's main works, right? To appreciate the greatness of this scholar, right? And we just have glimpses of his great rank. If you look at Shaykh Said Baghdash's commentary, you'll see some of the quotes in page 20 onwards of some of the praise of the ulama of him. But the most important of impact of Imam Nasafi is through the major works that he wrote, right? Along, of course, with the students he left behind. And Imam Nasafi wrote in a wide range of subjects. So in fiqh, it is said, right? It is said that Imam al-Nasafi wanted to write a commentary on the Hidayah, being, basically 2 generations separated from the Hidayah, and its impact was evident, and its importance and so on. But he had a vision in which it was inspired to him that it's unbecoming of someone of your rank to write a commentary on the Hidayah, rather write a book like the Hidayah and comment upon it. So he wrote a meta work called al-Wafi, the sufficiently comprehensive, you could call it that. And he wrote a brilliant commentary on it called al-Kafi. And al-Wafi, which is this comprehensive and true encompassing of the madhab, he tried to gather the most important issues in the major works of Imam Muhammad al-Hasan. And from Mukhtasar al-Quduri, and from another work called Manzumat al-Khilafiyat, and the most important issues in the works of Fatawa and Waqi'at, these common issues. He put this sort of mid-sized work that encompassed much of what's in Zahir al-Riwayah, in the major works of Imam Muhammad al-Hasan. But he didn't try to gather all of them. Like, he selected from al-Jami' al-Saghir and Jami' al-Kabir and al-Ziyadat, plus Mukhtasar al-Quduri. And there's an important work by an early 6th century Nasafi, Imam Najmuddin al-Nasafi. It's a different Nasafi, called Manzumatul Khilafiyat. This a brilliant poem in which he spells out the difference of opinion within the Hanafi school, and with great precision, between Imam and his 2 students, between the 2 students themselves, when all the different permutations between the 3 main Imams of the Hanafi school, Abu Hanifa, Abu Yusuf, Muhammad al-Hasan, but also then with the difference with Imam al-Shafi'i. And this work was commented upon very extensively. His own student, Ibn al-Sa'ati, would join between Mukhtasar al-Quduri and Manzumat al-Khilafiyat in his work, Majma' al-Bahrain. So it's evidently, there's much attention paid to it in those lands. Anyways, so he gathered this meta work called al-Wafi. And then he wrote one of the great commentaries in the madhab, al-Kafi, upon it. Al-Wafi has recently been published. And we'll see also why, right? Why it is of great importance, right? And it was used particularly because of its commentary, because he wrote a commentary on it in which he went into the legal reasoning, etc., and became an important source work. But the matan of the Wafi was large. It's published, it's on its way to me now, right? It's published in several volumes, right? So it's quite large, although I think a lot of that is due to the number of footnotes, but it's difficult to teach, because because of how large it is and how many issues it contains. So it was navigationally challenging. And the commentary, though great because of the greatness of the author, again, there's a lot to go through. So it became an important reference, but it was never taught like other never taught extensively like other works were taught, but it's consistently referenced to. And we'll be coming back to al-Wafi because there's a direct connection between al-Wafi and the Kanz. He also took a work called al-Fiqh al-Nafi' of al-Samarqandi. There's many Samarqandis in the madhab. So he took al-Fiqh al-Nafi' and al-Fiqh al-Nafi' is by Abu al-Qasim al-Samarqandi, if you want to make a note, who died in the year 556, right? And it was a mid-sized matan in the Hanafi school, quite detailed, and he wrote a commentary on it called al-Mustasfa, and that's now been published as of a few years ago. Beneficial work. He also wrote a work called al-Musaffa, which is also published now, in which he wrote a commentary on Manzumat al-Khilaf, which he took for his Wafi, but he wrote a work called al-Musaffa, in which he commented upon Manzumat al-Khilaf. So he wrote 3 substantial commentaries in the Hanafi school: al-Kafi, Sharh al-Wafi, al-Mustasfa, Sharh al-Fiqh al-Nafi', and al-Musaffa, Sharh Manzumat al-Khilaf. So 3 substantial commentaries, and that's a significant achievement of the later ulama. Few have written this, because writing fiqh is a heavy matter. He also wrote great works in usul al-fiqh. On Fridays we're looking at the Mukhtasar al-Manar, which is abridged from Imam Nasafi. Amongst that, he wrote his matan, the Manar, and we've talked about that in the Friday class on Mukhtasar al-Manar, which he distilled from the Usul of Imam al-Sarakhsi and the Usul of Imam al-Bajdawi. And he wrote a great commentary on it called Kashf al-Asrar. He also wrote a sharh on al-Husami's Muntakhab. Al-Husami, who was a slightly earlier 7th century scholar, he wrote a work called al-Muntakhab, and his name is tricky because his full name is Husam al-Din al-Ikhsikhthi. Husam al-Din al-Ikhsikhthi. It took me a long time. Don't worry. You don't have to worry about the name, right? Al-Ikhsikhthi. But he's famous as Al-Husami. And the text, the Muntakhab, is famous as Muntakhab al-Husami or Al-Husami. And Imam al-Nasafi wrote one of the important commentaries on it. And this Muntakhab was is rather more detailed than the Manar, and in many curricula it would be taught after the Manar, right? So, and al-Ikhsikhthi or al-Akhsikhthi, they differ on the ta'rib. And some say al-Ikhsikhthi, but Allahu A'lam. So Imam Nasafi wrote a commentary on al-Husami, as did many other scholars, and this al-Husami remains to this day part of the full Dars al-Nizami curriculum, and at Dar al-Fuqaha, Seeker's Guidance at Dar al-Fuqaha, it's one of the intermediate texts that's covered in Hanafi Usul al-Fiqh. So Imam Nasafi wrote an important commentary. His commentary on his Manar is arguably the greatest of the commentaries on the Manar, Kashf al-Asrar, but it's challenging and nuanced. Imam al-Nasafi also wrote in tafsir. He wrote a very important work in tafsir, famous as Tafsir al-Nasafi. But again, you have to be careful because there's at least 3 major Nasafis who wrote in tafsir. Right? But if you say Tafsir al-Nasafi, the Tafsir al-Nasafi that is meant is Imam Hafiz al-Din al-Nasafi's tafsir, which name is Madarik al-Tanzil. There's also recently a great tafsir by Imam Abu Hafs al-Nasafi called At-Taysir fi al-Tafsir. But he's a 6th century scholar who died about 150 years before Imam al-Nasafi. Imam al-Nasafi is of course not the author of the Aqa'id al-Nasafiyya, which is one of the earlier Nasafis, but he wrote a number of important works in theology, in Aqa'id, Kalam, amongst them a robust mid-sized matan in Aqidah called Umdatul I'tiqad, and he wrote a great commentary on it. It's famous as either Al-I'timad fi Sharh al-I'tiqad or just simply Sharh al-Umda. Right? Sharh al-Umda. Right? It's been famous by 2 titles, either Al-I'tiqad or Sharh al-Umda, and it's been published several times. It's considered a significant mid-sized work. The matan is a mid-sized matan, and the commentary is, in this Azhari edition. Or is it an Azhari edition? Anyways, yeah. Tell by the stuff. Is about 550 pages, mid-sized work in theology, highlighting some of the mention. And he wrote treatises and other things as well of significance. Okay, that's just a little bit to give us a bit of a feel of some of his work. So he wrote in fiqh, the most famous work, of course, which we haven't mentioned, which is the Kanz, right? But that's coming, right? The most famous and lastingly impactful work is the Kanz. None of his large works have had the influence of his smallest work, smallest complete work in fiqh. In usul, the Manar, which is his shortest contribution in usul, shortest complete contribution in usul, is of the most lasting significance. His tafsir is one of the concise Ahl Sunnah tafasir, and it is of great significance, easily overlooked. People say it's short, it doesn't have so many details, but it's a rich, beautiful tafsir, and there's a few works written on top of it. Each of these works has had significant impact, some more than others. Now, what distinguishes Imam al-Nasafi, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi? Right? Because many people wrote and many people authored. Right? But we can look at, from the praise of the ulama, 3 key characteristics, and these are also highlight why the Kanz al-Daqa'iq was of such significance in the Hanafi school as a text. 3 key qualities. One is it's the precision of Imam al-Nasafi. On any issue, he addresses it with great precision. He cuts through a lot of discussion, a lot of vagueness, etc. He's very precise in the way he presents issues. That's one aspect. But with that precision, he has significant, that there is an impressive depth to his writing. There's nuance to his writing. And there's a fourth quality, all of this with, in some key works, with conciseness. Right? With conciseness. Right? So this carries over to the text that we wanted to talk about now, which we will look at in part 2, Kanz al-Daqa'iq. We'll just take a brief touch at looking at some of its commentaries as well. So why was Kanz al-Daqa'iq written? Right? Why was Kanz al-Daqa'iq written? If we step back to what we saw last week in the opening, we looked at the transmission of the Hanafi madhab, etc., and the emergence of the mutun. And so, there's works like Imam Quduri's Mukhtasar and many other works. We've alluded to a couple like things, some which gained some prevalence, others that didn't. But Imam Quduri's Mukhtasar, which is the earliest of the lasting mutun of ongoing impact, he died in the year 428 after the Hijrah. And in the 5th century, in the 6th century, there's a number of works that were written that were impressive, etc. But ultimately, one of the things one of the criteria that they don't fulfill is that they're not ready teaching texts. Right? So they're great works. For example, even al-Fiqh al-Nafi' that we alluded to, of Abu al-Qasim al-Samarqandi from the mid-6th century. Important work, but difficult to teach. There was, in that 6th century, there's other works like that, like Tuhfat al-Fuqaha of al-Samarqandi, of Ala ad-Din al-Samarqandi. But my copy is in 3 volumes, right? So very good text, but just too long to fit in a teaching curriculum. So in the 7th century, you see multiple significant works, 2 scholars that died pretty much the same time, one from Mosul, the other from the eastern lands. You have Imam al-Mawsili, wrote his Mukhtar lil-Fatwa, he died 683, and Imam Burhan al-Sharia al-Mahbubi wrote his Wiqaya, and we talked about these. They lived at the same time as Imam Nasafi. Imam Nasafi outlived them a little bit. These are all varying attempts at the same thing, at having concise, summarized teaching texts for the madhab. And this became evident. There was a ilmi need, right? And Imam Nasafi will mention the reasons of his writing this work. The same reasons we will see are true for these works. But Imam Quduri his work, though great, was an early attempt. Right? It was, all said and done, a relatively early attempt. So it doesn't have sufficient preciseness, and it has, in a relative sense, it lacks something of preciseness. It lacks something of comprehensiveness, something of nuance, and there's a good, in relative terms, more issues that are not what the ulama settled upon as being Zahir al-Riwayah, as the scholars after affirmed. Imam al-Mawsili wrote a brief and precise matan, sticking broadly to Zahir al-Riwayah, called al-Mukhtar lil-Fatwa. Right? So it's precise, but it lacks a lot of nuances and extra details from the centuries of scholarship that came after Zahir al-Riwayah, many of those details which are important practically in the applying of fiqh. The Mukhtar historically was sunk by its commentary as a teaching text, because Imam al-Mawsili wrote such a great commentary on his own book, which is famous. The Ikhtiyar, which is now taught very widely, has always been deeply respected in the madhab, but it was an upper intermediate commentary, sort of one level below the Hidayah. It's almost like a stepping stone to the Hidayah. But because of that, it lacks a little bit on the side of nuance as a matan, though very precise. It's a good matan. We have it taught at Seekers. Al-Wiqaya summarizes the issues of the Hidayah. But the Hidayah takes only two components, right? Only two key components from the it relies the matan on which the Hidayah is based is Quduri, with its strengths but also with its weaknesses, plus al-Jami' al-Saghir of Imam Imam Muhammad ibn al-Hasan, right? So there's a lot beyond that, both in Zahir al-Riwayah and in legal details, right? Many of those were brought in by Imam al-Marghinani in the Hidayah and summarized in the Wiqaya, but there's still a need. There's still a need for a text that is precise, that is nuanced, that is deep, and that's what you find in the Kanz, right? That it gathers between these distinguishing characteristics of Mawlana and Nasafi's scholarship. So Al-Kanz that we're going to look at was written after Al-Wafi. So he himself describes it, right? That he gathered in it the issues of not just Mukhtasar al-Quduri, but he gathered within it several other works of Zahir al-Riwayah, al-Jami' al-Saghir, al-Jami' al-Kabir, other works of Muhammad al-Hasan. He tried to subsume Mukhtasar al-Quduri within it, and the Madhumat al-Khilafiyat of Najm al-Din al-Nasafi. So Al-Wafi, as a matan, was designed to be comprehensive of this earlier set of works that is representative of Zahir al-Riwayah. But that's not it. He also added many issues from that tradition of fatawa and waqi'at, of the issues that came in the fatawa of the mashayikh in those centuries, from the foundational first 2 centuries of the madhab and after, of the issues that affected people, etc. So, but then it was rather, the Wafi is rather large. So what does he do in the Kanz? He abridged the Kanz from the Wafi. But even in the abridging, he added details to it. And he'll tell us that in the opening of the Kanz, right? So it has the comprehensiveness of the Wafi, but pared down. It has precision and nuance, right? And he's careful to navigate through and try to convey what he held to be Zahir al-Riwayah, but also he adds a lot of nuances from those centuries of scholarship. Right? But with a keen sense of the educator, he kept it concise. He kept it concise. And we'll see his description of that in his opening. So this is why it has been described, the Kanz has been described as consistently as one of the greatest of the abridged works of the madhab, right? One of the greatest of the summary works, the mukhtasarat of the madhab, right? And because of these distinguishing qualities that we have touched upon. So in some I misspoke. Just one thing about al-Fiqh al-Nafi'. The author died in the year 665, right? 665, not 566 or whatever. There was an error in my notes, right? So he died in the the author of al-Fiqh al-Nafi', Abu al-Qasim al-Samarqandi, died 656 or thereabouts, right? Right? Now, the Kanz al-Daqa'iq, right? What is its place? So, the Kanz became a core teaching text in the Hanafi school, right? Became a core teaching text in the Hanafi school. And the curricula right? Generally, students when they begin would study 2 or 3 basic texts in the fiqh of worship to get familiar with the most basic matters of their religion. Then they would study Mukhtasar al-Quduri, because Mukhtasar al-Quduri is brief, its expressions are easy, and it doesn't have too many complex issues, right? So that's why it's now been taught for over 1,000 years, right? And it's been the first comprehensive step. And that's why we encourage those of you who haven't studied Mukhtasar al-Quduri to do that first, either Quduri or the Mukhtar, which we also offer at Seekers, first before doing the Kanz. Then they would study the Kanz al-Daqa'iq, right? Because Quduri gives them an introduction to all the chapters of fiqh and the core issues. Kanz al-Daqa'iq goes into the details, right? Imam al-Zayla'i, in his commentary on Kanz al-Daqa'iq, refers to it as أحسن مختصر في الفقه, the best brief work in fiqh. Al-Aini, in his commentary, Imam Badr ad-Din al-Aini, in his commentary on Kanz al-Daqa'iq, says that it's called the Kanz, the treasure chest, right? Because of how many issues it contains within it, buried from the Salaf, from those who've come before us, right? Because a Kanz, a treasure, is that which humans have buried of gold and silver in the earth. So we can call it treasure chest, but literally Kanz in Arabic, would be what human beings have buried of gold and silver for posterity, right? And it's a Kanz, and it Daqa'iq because of the subtleties it contains and how subtly it has been abridged, right? Imam al-Aini says that if Kanz al-Daqa'iq were just unpacked, would be unpacked. Pay attention to this. He says, if Kanz al-Daqa'iq, فَإِنَّهُ إِذَا بُسِطَ, if Kanz al-Daqa'iq would be unpacked, كَانَ أَكْثَرَ مِنْهُ عَشْرَ مَرَّاتٍ أو أكثر. That just Kanz al-Daqa'iq itself, if it were just unpacked, we're not saying explained, commented upon, would be 10 times or more larger than it presently is. Right? And others refer to it also as the best summary work in the madhab, right? Like Imam Zayn ibn Nujaym, Zayn ad-Din ibn Nujaym, his younger brother, who also commented on the work, Umar ibn Nujaym, in al-Nahr al-Fa'iq, he refers to Nasafi as أفضل للمتأخرين, as the best of the late scholars of the madhab. Right? 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 So he says, منتقى من منتقى من منتقى فائق. He says, كنز الدقائق منتقى من منتقى فائق. He says, كنز الدقائق, this treasure of subtleties, is a careful selection from a careful selection that supersedes any other work. In it, جمع أصول هذا الفن. It gathers the foundational issues of this subject, وقواعده, and its fundamental principles. واحتوى على غوامضه وشوارده, and it encompasses its deep and scattered issues. Right? So this is just pointing to its great importance. And the Kanz now introduces us to the nuances of the school. You know the core issues, you don't need to understand what does washing your face mean, what is washing, etc. But now you get to the nuances of the issues. And and that's why, we encourage, we're not trying to prevent anyone. If anyone on attending, you're more than welcome to. Alhamdulillah, there's been quite a lot of interest for this class. But we encourage you to be familiar with Quduri or the like first, then do the Kanz, and that's the natural order of things. But if someone wants to push themselves hard, you're most welcome. After this, the fuqaha, there's a need to go gradually, but there's also a need to go forward. So in different traditions, in some places they would go from this to Sharh al-Wiqaya, right? To Sharh al-Wiqaya, right? Right? So you'd go Quduri and then the Kanz, right? And then Sharh al-Wiqaya. Sharh al-Wiqaya now, you're familiar with the issues and the nuances. Now let's plunge into the legal reasoning. And Sharh al-Wiqaya consolidates what's in the Kanz and prepares you for the hidayah, because the wiqaya itself has all the issues in the hidayah. So now you can get to the hidayah ready, and you're introduced to legal reasoning by one of the masters. The author of Sharh al-Wiqaya is a great Hanafi usuli, Sadr al-Sharia. We'll see. In the Ottoman curriculum and elsewhere, here you would also find Multaqa al-Abhur, right? Multaqa al-Abhur by Ibrahim al-Halabi. We talked about the Meta Mutun. He died in the mid 10th century, 956 after the Hijrah, or 952. Hold on. 956. And this is one of the most commented works in the Hanafi school, because it was a lot of the teaching of the Hanafi school revolved around it. And many other, in some curricula, and this is certainly the case in Syria and elsewhere, the ikhtiyar took the place of Sharh al-Wiqaya at this level. And then you have the hidayah. And there's many other works between like the Kanz and the hidayah. Certainly in al-Azhar, in the Ottoman curriculum after the Multaqa, you had the Durar of Mullah Khusro, because Mullah Khusro also, coming, in the 8th and 9th century, he wrote a matan called the Ghurar, a nuanced matan, and he wrote a commentary on it called the Durar, and this was frequently commented upon, right? And then you have after a post Kanz text or two, at least one of which introduces you to legal reasoning, the Wiqaya or the Ikhtiyar and or the Durar, you get to the Hidayah of al-Marghinani, and then you have specialization, right? So this is the place of the Kanz, but the Kanz is at a midpoint within the madhab. The Kanz from the time of Imam Nasafi was taught, so countless commentaries have been written upon it. Right? There's well over 100 commentaries on the Kanz. Shuruh, but also Hawashi, commentaries on commentaries. It's useful to, you can classify the commentaries in many different ways. A simple, useful classification is to consider that there's three types of commentaries broadly. There are explanatory teaching commentaries that unpack the text and clarify it. There are commentaries that focus on legal reasoning. These are shuruh al-istidlal. Right? And then there's commentaries that focus upon the legal details. And we won't be going into a representative list of all these commentaries, because that would take us far from the scope of what we're covering. However, of the teaching and explanatory commentaries, two that have had great historical significance are the Sharh of Mullah Miskin, and this was taught for centuries. And we'll be referring to it, especially because we'll be referring to its Hashiyah, which we'll talk a bit about just briefly next class. Fathullah al-Mu'in by Abu Saud al-Masri, which is a Hashiyah, super commentary on the Sharh of Mullah Miskin. And there's Imam Badr al-Din al-Aini's commentary called Ramz al-Haqa'iq, which is a brief, precise commentary. Now, both of these commentaries, some places you see criticism that these are not reliable books. They're not reliable insofar as, one, because of their conciseness, and number two, particularly because of their conciseness. And they're sort of there to be explanatory. They're not there to give you the final legal position, etc., necessarily. Right? Rather like the Lubab, the great work, but it's not meant to be a book of fatawa, right? Then you have a great tradition of legal works, of legal reasoning written upon the upon Kanz al-Daqa'iq, but these are called shuruh al-istidlaliyya. Arguably the greatest of these is Tabyin al-Haqa'iq, published in 6 or 7 volumes by Imam al-Zayla'i, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi. And it's truly one of the great works of the Hanafi school. Right? One of the truly great works of the Hanafi school. We'll be referring to on occasion, and it's one of the resources that we're sharing with you in the course forum. And those of you, once you've registered, inshallah, we'll be adding you to the course forum. I'm not expected to read these books, but we'll be pointing to things that are important in there. A great Afghani scholar who moved to Damascus, from the first half of the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, Imam Abdul Hakim al-Afghani. He has a work called Kashful Haqa'iq Sharh Kanz al-Daqa'iq. Abdul Hakim al-Afghani, who had migrated to Damascus, rahimahullah ta'ala, and is an important and made an important contribution. It's a very brief commentary. He doesn't try to explain the text, pretty much. And he himself says this is like an abridgment of the Hidayah, insofar as that it's meant to be brief and precise. And and the Mashaykh of Damascus would pay attention to it. Shaykh Abdul Razak al-Halabi taught it on different occasions. Shaykh Adib Kallas also taught it. Alhamdulillah. So we'll be referring to this text due to its brevity. It's useful to point to reasoning mentioned there. And then you have the commentaries of legal details. The greatest of these is al-Bahr al-Ra'iq, the overwhelming ocean, by Imam Zayn ibn Nujaym and his younger brother, and wrote a commentary called An-Nahr al-Fa'iq, the river that overcomes. Okay? That his work is about a third of the size of his brother's work, but arguably he at least argues that it contains more. And we'll see that. So you'll hear these names frequently, and we'll try to avoid going left, right, and all over the place. Much of what we quote will be from these. I will primarily be referring to from the directly, for your purpose, the main book that we'll keep going back to is the Sharh of Mullah Miskin, with the Hashiyah, with the super commentary of Abu Saud, right? Abu Saud, and this is not the great Mufassir. This is a later Abu Saud, an 11th century scholar, right? Right? Muhammad Abu Saud ibn Ali who's from a line of distinguished scholarship, and that, so through that hear references to some of these other works. Sometimes we'll point to, so the Hashiyah of Abu Saud, because the Hashiyah of Abu Saud takes from al-Bahr al-Ra'iq, al-Nahr al-Fa'iq, Tabin al-Haqa'iq, but you hear these names, etc. And because it's written on top of the Sharh of Mullah Miskin, which is a good explanatory commentary, you'll hear about that. So that's just a little bit of background regarding the work here. And any questions before we proceed? We'll give you a moment. If you'd like to ask any questions, you're more than welcome to.
So last week and today we went a little bit about the history and how the Kanz was taught. When the Kanz was traditionally taught, was it always taught with a commentary, or were there like some people who taught it without commentaries?
No, generally it was taught as the text itself.
What are our goals and what we're supposed to retain in this class? Are we just trying to understand the Kanz and its issues, or are we also trying to get the legal reasoning?
Sorry? Are we trying to get?
Are we also trying to understand the legal reasoning?
No, the primary purpose is to understand the issues of the madhab and the nuances in there, and to begin familiarizing ourselves with the legal reasoning, right? We'll touch upon the legal reasoning, but just a little bit without going into it too much. The focus is to understand the issues with their nuances, and there's an introduction to the legal reasoning here, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Okay, Bismillah. So we'll be looking at the opening of Kanz al-Daqa'iq. So before we begin, and with the intention that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala open for us the Kanz al-Daqa'iq, and that we attain through it the realities of fiqh as a subject and as an understanding and as a reality, so that we know ourselves and what is for us and against us, and we're able to call Allah's creation so that they may know themselves and what counts for them and against them of the matters of this life and the next, leading to the good pleasure of Allah. And with all those noble meanings pointed to by the author and sought by the author and by those who have transmitted this text to us. Al-Fatiha. Okay. So نروي بسندنا إلى المؤلف رحمه الله تعالى. We relate with our chains of transmission back to the author رحمه الله تعالى. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In the name of Allah, merciful and compassionate. قال الإمام النسفي رحمه الله تعالى: الحمد لله الذي أعز العلم في الأعصار وأعلى حزبه في الأمصار، والصلاة والسلام على رسوله المختص بهذا الفضل العظيم وعلى آله الذين فازوا منه بحظ جسيم. Right? So you see an evident eloquence in the opening of the author. There's a number of points that arise here. Of course, the author begins with the basmala and the hamd, and these could be explained and detailed, but we won't go into the nuances regarding these, but this is a sunnah of beginning, that one begin with the basmalah and the hamdallah and salah on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his folk. Right? Just very, very briefly, when we say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, the ba here is for seeking assistance, for isti'ana, right? We say Bismillah out of reverence, right? And it's a signifier of divine mercy, that we don't say Billah because you're making a great claim. So you say by Allah I begin, meaning I am indeed truly reliant upon Allah. I am not self-directed. I am not, right? And that's it's a major claim. Whereas if we say, I begin in the name of Allah, you have mentioned His name, so you have been true in your claim. The divine name Allah is the greatest name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, alam ala dhat al-wajib al-wujud. It is the personal name of the entity that is the necessary existent. Al-muttasif bi jami'i sifat al-kamal, characterized by all attributes of perfection. Al-munazzah an jami'i simat al-naqs, transcendent beyond all characteristics of imperfection. Al-khaliqi lil-alam, the creator of all the worlds. وَهُوَ رَبُّ الْعَالَمِينَ, He's the Lord of all existence. Right? Ar-Rahman, right? He is the one character. Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim are both from Rahmah, and when ascribed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is Allah's choosing to grant good and granting His good comprehensively and encompassingly. That's the indication of Rahman, and particularly and specifically, that's the indication of His being Rahim. And then he says, Alhamdulillahi alladhi a'azza al-ilma fil a'sar. All praise is Allah's, who has ennobled sacred knowledge through all ages. Right? All praise is due to Allah. Alhamd is all good mention of honor is Allah's. Right? Alhamd, all praise or praise itself is Allah's, milkan wa istihqaqan. He owns it and He deserves it. Who has honored, a'azza, right? 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 Who has honored knowledge. And here, al-ilm, the al here is referential. Mullah Miskeen says, ilm al-shara'i' wal-ahkam, the knowledge of divine guidance and its rulings. Right? Whereas all knowledge is noble, but and this points to, it contains within it an indication to the fada'ilul ilm. And it contains within it an implicit thing. Why are we engaging in this? Because izz, walillahi al-izzah, Allah's is all honor. Right? 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 Lillahi al-izzatu wa li rasulihi wa lil mu'mineen. Allah's is all honored, and His messengers, and for the believers. Allah has all absolute honor, and those who are connected to Him are honored, have honor insofar as they're connected to Him, and insofar as they're connected to His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? So Allah, and what is the masdarul izz? What is the source of izz? of knowledge. What's the masdar al-izz? Al-ilm. It's bil-ilm. يرفع الله الذين آمنوا منكم والذين أوتوا العلم درجات. Allah raises those who believe amongst you and have been granted knowledge many degrees. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to honor us in that way and make us worthy of that honor. Right? And so it refers to all knowledge, but the knowledge that matters, that knowledge that will have consequence in the hereafter. And it's contextually important here. Al-ilm, the referential, this knowledge that we're looking at now, because this is knowledge of how to submit to Allah individually and how to assist others in submitting to Allah. That is the beginning of all turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? الذي أعز العلم في الأعصار, throughout the ages. Right? Right? And al-a'sar, throughout the ages, plural of asr, which is a period of time. وَأَعْلَى حِزْبَهُ فِي الْأَمْصَارِ, and who has raised its party. Right? Its party, its people. Fil amsar, and in some copies, fil ansar, right? And has raised its party, right? And has raised its party, and hizb is a group of people, right? 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 And raised meaning. And this is pointing to the Quran. يَرْفَعِ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا مِنْكُمْ. Allah raises those who believe amongst you and those who have been granted knowledge, darajat, many degrees. Above whom? Above those who don't have knowledge and above those who don't have faith. Right? And Allah's raising them means He has honored them in this life and they have His closeness and His good pleasure in the next. Right? Fil amsar, across the lands. And they have been raised, why? And fiqh, particularly because fiqh is the source that everybody needs fiqh. Because everybody prays. Things come up in your prayer. Everybody engages in the acts of devotion. People get married, people transact, people deal with things in life where there's halal and haram. People disagree, people dispute. Right? And fiqh relates to the day-to-day actions of those morally responsible. So those who are able to act according to divine guidance in their day-to-day and who are able to show other people how to remain within the limits of Allah in their day-to-day, they are assisting people in being in submission to Allah and preserving the good of this life for His creation. وَالصَّلَاةُ وَالسَّلَامُ, and all blessings and peace عَلَى رَسُولِهِ, be upon His Prophet. As-salah, right? Salah refers to dua with good, as Mullah Miskin said, dua bil khair, asking for good. Right? And they say it's طلب الرحمة المقرونة بالتعظيم. It's to seek mercy with veneration. Right? With veneration. والصلاة, some copies only mentions والصلاة على رسوله. Right? والصلاة والسلام in some copies, others والصلاة على رسوله. Right? And salam is asking for Allah's peace. Right? Mullah Miskin's copy doesn't have wassalam. على رسوله, upon his prophet, upon his messenger. He doesn't refer to the Prophet ﷺ here, and this is an eloquent way. Upon his messenger. His messenger has ikhtisas, and not mentioning the name is that he is Allah's messenger and he is so well known, we don't need to mention his name. We say his messenger, you know who it is. Right? So this is a sigha of ta'zeem, because normally you refer to someone by the dhamir, by the pronoun if you've already mentioned them before. But he is hadirun dhihnan, he is present in people's minds. When you say Rasul, what comes to you is al-Kamil, al-Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Ala rasulihi. Al-Mukhtassi bihadha al-fadl al-azim. The one who is uniquely characterized with this tremendous fadl, this tremendous virtue and rank, right? Which fadl and rank, Mullah Miskin says, fadlul ilm, right? That he is manba'ul ilm, he is the source of guide of this knowledge. Al-Mukhtas bihadha al-fadl al-azim, fadlul ilm, right? With this, all praise is due to Allah who has honored knowledge across the ages and raised its people across the lands. And blessings be upon, or blessings and peace be upon his messenger, al-Mukhtas bihadha al-fadl, pointing to the fadl al-ilm. Right? Why? Because what is knowledge? That which has come from Allah, from the Quran. It has come through the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? Anzalahu ala qalbik. Allah has revealed it to the heart of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? And his guidance, right? The sources of sacred knowledge are the Quran and the Sunnah. All the other tools are derivative or interpretive. Ijma', scholarly consensus, لابد له من مستند, has a basis in the Quran or the Sunnah. Legal analogy is making analogy on what's established from the Quran and the Sunnah. And all the other derivative principles, they're all go back to understanding and deriving and interpreting revelation. All of it, it's manba, he is its basis. He is also the one who has complete izz. All honor in creation is embodied in the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. هذا الفضل العظيم, that is tremendous. Right? And much more could be said about these lines, but that would take us away from the topic. Right? And after him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the shara'i' of all other prophets are abrogated, because only his sharia remains. So anyone else wants to follow the clear path of divine guidance, all other shara'i', all other divine guidances were corrupted before his coming and abrogated upon his coming. Right? Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? Wa ala alihi, and upon his folk. Right? Right? And al is can refer to the family of someone, ahl of someone, right? But the basis of al is every believer, kullu mu'min, right? And that's what's chosen by Abu Saud in his Hashiyah, right? وَالْمُرَادُ بِهِ بِالْآلِ هُنَا كُلُّ مُؤْمِن. Right? What's meant is all the believers, right? Because al refers to the people who follow someone, and so you can see that here, page 20 in Mullah Miskin. الَّذِينَ فَازُوا مِنْهُ بِحَظٍ جَسِيمٍ, who attained success, fawz, minhu, from him, meaning from the messenger, or who succeeded through this knowledge, بِحَظٍ جَسِيمٍ, with a weighty share, بِحَظٍ جَسِيمٍ. Right? فَازُوا مِنْهُ, either مِنَ الرَّسُولِ, who succeeded by him, by the messenger, or by this knowledge with a حظ جسيم. Right? فَمَنْ أَخَذَهُ فَقَدْ أَخَذَ بِحَظٍ وَافِرٍ. And this come in the hadith of the scholars are the inheritors of the prophets. The prophets leave behind no money nor offspring. What they leave behind is knowledge. So whoever takes of it takes off a great share. So pointing to that. And you see the connection between knowledge and the Prophet ﷺ, right? And that reminds us. So there are many layers of reminder here. Most of the commentators mention here about the many pointings here. It's called bara'atul istihlal, an adept opening, a suitable opening, because he praises Allah for honoring knowledge, the knowledge of guidance, right? And the people of knowledge, right? And he is pointing to the knowledge. He's also, of course, also pointing subtly to the merit of fiqh over other religious knowledge. Why? Because you don't need a mufassir in your city necessarily. It's useful to have them, but you could, the urgent issues of people's lives generally revolve around fiqh throughout the ages and across the lands. Okay, so he's praising fiqh, ilm in general, but it's understood that the knowledge that it has proved to be needed across time and across the lands is fiqh. And, if people ask 100 questions, if a Muslim asks 100 questions of religion, more than 90 of them are going to do with fiqh, typically, and there's other things are secondary. A practicing Muslim, not a distracted Muslim, right? Then, in the opening, there is a glorious praising of the author, right? This is very eloquent, right? So he says, and this is usually not, this is here not written by the author, this would be written by a student or a scribe, right? So it says, قال مولانا الحبر النحرير صاحب البيان والبنان في التقرير والتحرير. Our master, Maulana, right? The Mawla. Now this is of the terms. One thing you just have to get over is that language works with the absolute and the relative, right? So when we use Maulana with respect to creation, it's in the relative sense. When you use it for Allah, Anta Maulana, you are our master, meaning in the absolute sense, right? Otherwise you can't speak, because say you're knowledgeable, that would be shirk, because Allah has absolute knowledge. So it's the absolute and the relative. قال مولانا, our master, al-Habr. Al-Habr is the one who has deep knowledge, right? 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 Now, some copies, right, don't have this opening, right? If you see Mullah Miskin's commentary, he just says, قال الضعيف الفقير إلى الله. The weak and needy of Allah says, right? That's quite interesting, right? There are different copies because these are added by the nusakh, right? So this majestic opening, so we don't have to spend a lot. Al-Habr, the deeply knowledgeable, Al-Nihrir, literally the one who slaughters knowledge, right? 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 But what it means is the adept, expert, experienced, deeply aware scholar. صاحب البيان والبنان في التقرير والتحرير, the one who has the ability to express and who is pointing to in the taqrir, in their explaining issues, and their tahrir, and their resolving of issues. كاشف المشكلات, the one who uncovers the issues that are difficult. والمعضلات, and the issues that people get stuck upon. مبين الكنايات والإشارات, who clarifies the indirect and elusive expressions. منبع العلا, right, the source of all nobility, right, by benefiting from his knowledge and teachings and example. علم الهدى, the sign of guidance. علامة الورى, the reference scholar across the sciences for people. الورى الناس, right. مالك أزمة الفتية, the master of the matter of fatwa in his time. مظهر كلمة الله العليا, the one who manifests Allah's raised word, also perhaps pointing to his writing a great tafsir, but also the kalima of Allah, amongst other meanings, is the hukm of Allah, the ruling of Allah. كشاف الحقائق, the great uncoverer of realities of knowledge. مبين الدقائق, the one who manifests the subtle matters of knowledge. سلطان علماء الشرق والصين, the sultan of the scholars of the East and China, right, pointing to his being from the eastern lands. حافظ الحق والملة والدين, the protector of truth and this community and religion, because the ulama are the inheritors of the prophets, right? And this needs to be kept in mind, right? شمس الإسلام والمسلمين, the shining sun of Islam and Muslims. وارث علوم الأنبياء والمرسلين, the inheritor of the knowledges of the prophets and messengers. Abu al-Barakat, Abdullah ibn Ahmad ibn Mahmud al-Nasafi, right, that's his name. أفاض الله عليه أنوار رحمته, may Allah shower upon him from the lights of his mercy. وتغمده بمغفرته, and may Allah encompass him in his divine forgiveness. وأسكنه في جناته, and may Allah make him dwell in his high gardens. Ameen. Of course, none of this is found in some of the other copies. This beautiful, eloquent. Now, there's a quick point. Praise is the basis of praise is for it to be emphatic. But praise is emphatic and praiseworthy when it is true. Exaggerated praise is to mention things about someone that are not correct. It's to mention things about someone that are not correct. Right? So this needs to be noted, right? In each of these qualities, there's a basis of being emphatic, right? But emphatic praise is from the ways of praise, and each age and each context has ways of praise that are suitable for it. But when the praise is sound, it's not exaggeration and it's not inappropriate. Like if you use these terms for your local Imam, who's just a nice guy, it would not be correct. But Imam, each of these qualities is sound and true, if soundly understood. He explains why he wrote this text. Right? He says, لما رأيت الهمم مائلة إلى المختصرات, when I saw, قال الإمام النسفي رحمه الله, لما رأيت الهمم مائلة إلى المختصرات, when I saw that people's resolves, the resolves of people, right? And of course, it's people who incline, right? But this al-himam, because it's himmatun nas, right? Himma is ma yatawajjahu ilayhi hammuhum. Himma is where someone's concern, what someone's concern is directed to. You have ham, which is what concerns you. And that concern directed to an outcome is the himma. Now, it's actually people who are directed. The capacity of directedness, that's called himma. But this is an eloquent expression. لَمَّا رَأَيْتُ الْهِمَّ, when I saw resolve. It's actually, he saw the people with their resolve directed towards brief works. But in this, of course, is of the many meanings, is that you are what your concern is. Right? You are what your concern is. You want to do an accounting of where you are with Allah. See, what concerns you on a weekly basis? What concerns you about matters of religion? If you are more excited with qeel and qal, with this person said this, and this person said this, and that person did that, and that person did that, that's what your worth is. لما رأيت الهمم مائلة, when I saw inclinations inclined towards brief works. اختصر is, the mukhtasar is يعني ما فيه تقليل المبنى مع إبقاء المعنى, that which reduces the size while retaining the meaning. That's a mukhtasar. والطباع راغبة عن المطولات, and people's temperaments. The طبع is the nature of a person. راغبة عن المطولات, they incline away from the large works. And the mutawwalat are the great reference works of the madhab. Like his own Kafi, for example. أردت أن ألخص الوافي, I sought to summarize al-Wafi. And we mentioned al-Wafi gathered issues from a wider selection of books of Zahir al-Riwayah than gathered by Imam al-Quduri, but also subsumed Mukhtasar al-Quduri in it, subsumed a lot of what's in Manzumat al-Khilafiyat of Najmuddin al-Nasafi, and issues from the Fatawa and so on. Decide to summarize it into a terse, precise, clear matan without the things that are not needed. So he explains, بِذِكْرِ مَا عَمَّ وُقُوعُهُ, by mentioning that which occurs most commonly. Number one, وَكَثُرَ وُجُودُهُ, and that which is commonly found. لِتَكْثُرَ فَائِدَتُهُ, in order for its benefit to be greater. وَتَتَوَفَّرَ عَائِدَتُهُ, and for its benefit to be fully realized. Right? So he focused on what's common, important, and beneficial. And this is very important for the talib al-ilm. أما ما ينفع الناس فيمكث في الأرض. Right? As for that which benefits people, that's what remains on earth. Right? And that's where people's concern should be. ما ينفع الناس, ما كثرت فائدته, that which is of most benefit for yourself, for others. Right? فشرعت فيه بعد التماس طائفة من أعيان الأفاضل. So I began this upon the request, right, of a group of the foremost of the afadil, ahl al-fadl. A'yan al-afadil is, a'yan al-afadil are the foremost of the people of virtue. Iltimas, right? Iltimas is a request made with adab. The default is iltimas is something done by one's peers, right? But not necessarily. It can also be a request with adab. Imam al-Zamakhshari in Asas al-Balagha explains it, because the root is lams, to touch, right? After the request of of some of the a'yan al-afadil, the foremost of the afadil, ahl al-fadl, the people of virtue, nobility, presumably here, the people of the learned ulama, after a polite request from a group of the notable, of the foremost of the notable, وَأَفَاضِلِ الْأَعْيَانِ, and of the most noble of the elect. أَفَاضِلِ الْأَعْيَانِ الْأَفَاضِلِ, the foremost of the virtuous and the most virtuous of the notable, the most notable of the virtuous and the most virtuous of the notable. Because you can be of the afadil but not be notable, and you can be of the notable but not be virtuous. الَّذِينَ هُمْ بِمَنْزِلَةِ الْإِنسَانِ لِلْعَيْنِ, who are with respect, who are like. Now he uses, there's multiple uses of balagha here. He says, الَّذِينَ هُمْ بِمَنْزِلَةِ الْإِنسَانِ لِلْعَيْنِ وَالْعَيْنِ لِلْإِنسَانِ, who are akin to the insan for the ayn and the ayn for the insan. So he uses both insan and al-ayn are words that are mushtarak, that are shared in meaning. So he used some balagha in the previous statement, which we don't need to go into, right? And here, insan can refer to the human being, but insan also refers to the light of the eye. So they are like the light for the eye. الَّذِينَ هُمْ بِمَنْزِلَةِ الْإِنسَانِ لِلْعَيْنِ, who are akin to the light of the eye, the capacity of seeing for the eye. وَالْعَيْنِ لِلْإِنسَانِ, and like the eye for the human being. So they're like the capacity, because if you have eyes, we don't have the capacity to see. What use is the eye? You have eyeballs, but which you cannot see. Right? So they are like the light, the capacity to see for the eye. That's the insan, lil-ayn. Wal-ayn lil-insan, and the eye for the human being. A person, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect the vision of our eyes and our insight. Right? If you can't see, you are stunted. مَا مَا بِي مِنَ الْعَوَائِقِ, despite all that I have of preventatives. Right? So this is al-i'tiraf bil-qusur. Right? And this is the nature of ilm, that the nature of the human being, that the human being is busy, right? Being needy in this life, having responsibilities in this life, personal, familial, social, collective, etc. And the ulama tend to be of the most busy of people. مَعَ مَا بِي مِنَ الْعَوَائِقِ وَسَمَّيْتُهُ بِكَنْزِ الدَّقَائِقِ, and I named it Kanz al-Daqa'iq, the treasure. And the Kanz is often referred to a treasure chest, but it's actually the buried treasure. And the Kanz, as we quoted from Imam al-Aini, right? Right? It points to the reality of right? Right? So, and Abu Sa'ud mentions, you can find it page 24 of his Hashia, right? That he called it a kanz, a treasure, bi'atibari, because of what it contains of so many issues, right? That he has buried within it. Because a kanz is a name for that which has been buried by humans of gold or silver. And he ascribed this kanz as being full of subtleties because of what it contains of subtle issues that require a sharp mind and deep thought to derive it. Right? Right? And between the kanz and the daqa'iq, right, there's also that refined souls, the nufus al-zakiyya, would incline towards treasure. It's something worthy. And it's subtle. Right? Because only a fool would say, yeah, I just want the simple stuff. Right? No. The kayyis, the smart person, wants that which is deep and subtle and is not content to live a life of folly. Right? So then he explains, وَهُوَ وَإِنْ خَلَى عَنِ الْعَوِصَاتِ وَالْمُعْضِلَاتِ. And this text, وَهُوَ أي الكنز, هذا المتن المستحضر ذهنا. And this, even if it is free of the really complex and difficult to resolve issues, right? Because the Wafi contained a lot of those complex and difficult to resolve issues, where the fuqaha stopped and they said it could be understood in more than one way. We're not sure about the reasoning of the Imam about this. We're not sure. There's فَقَدْ تَحَلَّ بِمَسَائِلِ الْفَتَاوَى وَالْوَاقِعَاتِ. It is adorned بِمَسَائِل أي بِطَائِفَةٍ من with some issues from the works of fatawa and waqi'at, and the issues addressed by the ulama that occurred to people. مُعْلَمًا بِتِلْكَ الْعَلَمَاتِ, putting indications in them to the khilaf within the madhab. These alamat have basically been lost, right? Because he added indicators of what the khilaf is between Abu Hanifa and his companions, Abu Hanifa and Imam Shafi'i. Much of that has not, the scribes tend to be hasty, and this was basically lost in the matn itself. وَزِيَادَةِ الطَّاء لِلْإِطْلَاقَاتِ, right? And adding a ta for issues that are mentioned without condition. Right? Because some places he mentions something generally, and it being general is meant. And an example given in Kashf al-Haqa'iq of Mawlana Abdul Hakim al-Afghani, you can find it on page 5, and it's actually quoted by Shaykh Said Bakdash from there as well, that he says, وَيَنْقُضُهُ خُرُوجُ نَجَسٍ. Wudu is invalidated by the exiting of filth. Any filth that comes out, right? Whether from the private parts or elsewhere, whether regular or not. This is itlaq, unconditioned. Right? We'll see examples of that when it comes, right? but pointing to the fact that when he mentions something generally, often it is meant to be general. Wallahu al-muwaffiq lil-itmam, and Allah is the one who grants facilitation for completion. Wal-muyassir lil-ikhtitam, and the one who makes easy the way to good ending. Wallahu a'lamu bis-sawab, and Allah knows best what is most correct. Right? And that Wallahu a'lam bis-sawab is there in some copies, not in others. It's not there in Mullah Miskeen, for example. And then we reach Kitab al-Tahara. So we'll begin next class by looking at the book of purity, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, asking Allah for purity of resolve, for purity of purpose, for purity of faith, for purity of submission, for purity of states, for purity in our character, to purity in our conduct. And that we remove all qadar, all gross from our aspirations and our conduct and our character and our states, and He forgive us for our shortcomings, and that He grant us the izz of ilm by which He has honored the best of His creation. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Any questions before you concede?
Last week, when we were going through the order in which a lot of curriculums teach, we mentioned that we do the ibadat, and after they teach quduri, then kanz and wiqaya. Is this like exactly like that, or is it like a student would learn the mutun and then he would continue, or is it that there's sometimes pauses between mutuns where they're taught secondary books to strengthen one thing or another?
So what's the question? That's a whole range of possibilities. Do you want me to comment? Like, what's the question particularly?
The question is, do teachers often introduce secondary works between mutun, or is it more so that one would carve through mutun first?
No. I mean, there's also the reality that students need to finish because there's work to do, right? So it's a basic curriculum, but a madrasa curriculum is meant to be a basic curriculum. It does not specialize someone to be a faqih, but also someone who wants to master would, even during their studies, would study more. So for example, to cite the practical example of Damascus, actually Kanz wasn't that common in Damascus in the late 90s, certainly when I was there. Generally they would study a few short works, then they'd do Nur al-Idah, Quduri, right? Then the Lubab, then the Ikhtiyar, right? That's a very basic, that's a sort of core madrasa curriculum. Because the Ikhtiyar takes, in a madrasa setting, about 3 years to cover. I'd done 2-3 times a week, takes several years to cover, right? So that's a core curriculum, right? But outside the madrasa, right? So people would do a brief text, then quduri, then the maraqi, but students who are serious would do several brief texts. Then with Nur al-Idah, they would also do maraqi al-falah. In Damascus, they would frequently do the Hadiyya al-Ala'iyya of Ala ad-Din Abidin. When they did quduri, sometimes they'd do other texts as well at a quduri level, maybe a contemporary text that is simple and clear. When they do the Lubab, in Damascus, it was very common, just the texts that were being taught in the halaqat of the mashayikh I was connected with. People, while they would study the Lubab, Shaykh Hassan taught a number of us al-Jawhar al-Nayyira. Shaykh Muhammad Jum'ah taught us the Multaqa al-Abhur. I was encouraged to attend Kashf al-Haqa'iq, Sharh Kanz al-Daqa'iq, which Shaykh Abdul Razak al-Halbi covered a big chunk of, and we would review outside of it. There's some people teaching Fath Bab al-Inaya. There's other mashayikh teaching other texts. We covered the Durar of Mullah Khusro with Shaykh Hassan al-Hindi, although that wasn't common anymore in Damascus at all. There are actually no copies of that or al-Jawhar al-Nayyira. Other people would do other works, right? But generally, a core curriculum would contain 5-6 books, but many more books would be covered at each of these levels, right? In Damascus, generally they wouldn't study Sharh at that time. Sharh al-Wiqaya wasn't in the curriculum, but the ikhtiyar was, then they'd do the Hidayah in the Takhassus program at Ma'had al-Fath. But students who were specializing in Damascus, they would also do al-Ashbah wal-Nadha'ir. They would do, it was very common in Damascus to do complete readings of Hashiyat ibn Abidin. Some of the mashayikh would go through Tabyin al-Haq, but that's in the specialization phase. They would go through the larger works as well. So fiqh, and they would keep connected with their teachers in covering those things. So fiqh is a long journey, right, in studying it and teaching it. But there's a core that anyone needs to cover, but that core is not, okay, khalas, I've studied. Right? I've begun. I now have at least basic tools to be able to understand the texts. But that's not enough for deep understanding, and it's nowhere close to even aspiring for mastery. And in other places, the other texts would be emphasized, right? And students are also expected to read a lot on their own, but guided reading with their teachers, right? So in the Indian subcontinent, you have many other teaching texts. The mashayikh would frequently recommend contemporary texts related to the subjects, right? There's many great recent Hanafi scholars who've written important books on different subjects, and those would be recommended, right? Etc. Any other questions?
Once we've unpacked and understood the medicine of Kanz with commentaries
that's a big statement. Once you've unpacked,
so at least just with the Miskeen, just the basic meaning of the medicine, which is what you said we have to come into class with.
Yeah. Okay.
So after that has been done with, for example, the Miskeen, what other supplementary readings would you recommend, or should we just stay away from secondary readings?
We can discuss that offline. Right now, for a student, there's 3 resources that we'll make sure that are added to the course, right? What are they? Fathullah al-Mu'in, that's Mullah Miskeen plus Abu Saud. Number 2 is Kashf al-Haqa'iq, Sharh Kanz al-Daqa'iq, both volumes. Do you have both volumes? Yeah. And number 3 is, what's number 3? Yeah, there's the Bushra edition of footnotes on the Kanz that helps unpack the Kanz. That's more than sufficient. Someone wants to do more, we can discuss a plan to do more, but the key is write out the text and really try to understand it clearly. If a student wants to do more and they have some exposure, one thing is always good to consolidate the core. As we're going through ibadat, review Nur al-Idah and Maraqi. Right? If you've done Quduri with Lubab, review Quduri and Lubab, because consolidating is very powerful, and you'll find cross references. So that's a good question, right? Is use this text to consolidate what you've done before, Nur al-Idah and Quduri. If you've done parts of the Lubab before this, then you incorporate that, and that's more than sufficient. Here and there, I'll be pointing to other texts, and there's no harm, but let's go step by step in that, right? Let's go step by step in that, right? Because while it's ultimately you want to swim in the oceans, you should know how to navigate the ocean, because there's also sharks there, and you can bash your head into a coral reef if you swim with your eyes closed, right? So, as absurd as it sounds, but people die every year by swimming into coral reefs, right? Because you have to keep in mind that there may be things ahead of you in the water, right? So it's amazing how people die in the ocean, right? I was wondering, how do people die in the ocean? Like, sometimes people get bitten by sharks because they actually kicked the shark, because they're just staying afloat in the water. They don't realize that there's sharks in the shallow water, so the shark's just doing its sharking around, and they kick the shark. It's really absurd, but it apparently happens, right? So similarly, but we will be pointing to certain issues, right? And those are good to cultivate, but slowly, right? Because the key success in someone will be successful that someone's asked, okay, explain this part of the Kanz, and you could explain it without having to look at the text or the commentary or anything else. And if they ask you 10 questions about it, you would know not just what the text says, but also at least some level of its indications, right? And the mashayikh, like one, each stage you give it that stage its due, right? So we're but I'll be referencing other things here and there, but let's not get ahead of ourselves in that, inshallah. Barakallahu ta'ala fikum. Any other questions before we close?
Afwan, Shaykh, I was just wondering if the slides that we're having in the classes, are they going to be shared to the class forum?
Yes, bi'idhnillah.
Faraz, are you aware of Fathullah al-Mu'in being available online for purchase? I wasn't able to find any.
Yeah, it has been before. We need to get the Hashia and Fathullah al-Mu'in over here from Istanbul. They've been copied, so please please chase after me about that, inshallah. Alhamdulillah. So in the meantime, there is the PDF copy, but we've, I requested, I think, 5 copies of the Arabic. So let's just chase me down for that, inshallah. Okay, so we'll stop there, inshallah. We'll start the next class at 5:30. Assalamu alaikum.